Hi, my name is Jill Stansberry. My thesis is called Dealing with Diversity, and it was about the perceptions of teachers, parents, and administrators of the responsiveness of Montessori programs to working with students and families of color. So my question was, what are the baseline experiences of these different people in school communities when Montessori is applied in cross-cultural teaching situations? So there's a significant body of research that suggests that when students are in a cross-cultural learning situation, their learning is actually negatively impacted unless their teachers have a positive social justice perspective that they bring and the kids are aware of. So I wanted to know, do Montessori teachers have social justice perspectives? And are kids and families aware of them? Do they know what the needs of students of color are that would be different than other students? So I began to ask questions and talk to people. What I found was that some teachers were aware, the minority of teachers were aware that there were good practices for teaching kids who had different home languages or home dialects of English and incorporated their foundational knowledge from home with language instructions at school, but most teachers were unaware that that was a good practice. I also found that there were some things in the Montessori environment that were naturally inclusive, such as the cultural curriculum was about culture. So in Montessori we study culture, and to be adding in somebody's home culture is not really an addition, it's part of the curriculum. Parents are also welcome and invited into the program to share their knowledge and skills, and parent education is also part of what we do. The idea that parents are learning about Montessori and how to incorporate it into the home. So those are all good inclusion practices that we see in Montessori programs that we might not see in more traditional education. I took a framework from clinical psychology. They're called racial microaggressions, and it's a way of breaking down the unconscious biased behavior that clinical psychologists might have that would have a negative impact on their client's experience. And I thought if that's happening and helpful for making clinical psychologists aware of unconscious bias, it would probably be helpful for teachers as well. So I looked at practices in schools from that lens, and what I discovered was that there's one category called environmental microaggressions. So in some Montessori programs, students of color might not see themselves represented in the faculty at all, or if they were represented in the faculty, it would be lead teachers, not any assistant teachers. And that is tied into a significant issue in Montessori programs where people of color, not just Montessori education, there are fewer educators of color than there are percentage of people of color in the population. And so in order to address that, we probably need to put together some long-range recruiting and development practices so that students see themselves in the environments. Different school buildings had different amounts of environmental inclusion. For instance, one school only had pictures of animals on the wall. In another school, there were murals depicting the students from the different groups that were represented in the school building. So one school had no depictions of anybody from any culture as well, and another school building was actually named for a local businessman who was an African American. I also went in and did observations in classrooms to see if people were using language practices that were appropriate. And what I discovered in doing that was that there was a tendency or a trend for white boys to interrupt lessons more than other students. And in one particular classroom, I tracked those interactions and also teacher responses to that. And what I noticed was that white boys were redirected least, but they interrupted the most. And that after that, white girls were redirected more than white boys, but they also interrupted significantly. The next highest group of interruptions were African American girls, and they were redirected more than both white girls and white boys, and African American boys and Latino boys and girls did not interrupt at all. And that suggests that there is some bias present around both gender and ethnicity when interrupting behaviors. There are many other things that presented themselves in the project that would be very helpful to look at, or for other researchers to look at. One would include the actual students' perceptions of teachers about their own success. So there's some research that suggests that students of color do not necessarily get the same encouragement at home from their parents to achieve at school, because school is set up to be an unjust place for them, where they don't necessarily, where it's much more difficult for them to succeed because of those unconscious biases that they might be experiencing. So actually the teacher's perception of their ability to be successful is up to 3 times more impactful on them than their dominant group peers. So that's a line of inquiry that, if we could go down, somebody could start to look at what exactly happens when kids interrupt and what kids' perceptions are of how their teachers feel about them. That would be really helpful to further look at and understand the dynamics of what's happening in classrooms that have schools in general, and in particular Montessori schools, perpetuate racist, sexist, and classist practices that further create a stratified society and make it so that students of color might have different experiences in the same classrooms as students from dominant groups.